Sarian to his wife with her 13 qualities. Also what is nice is the order, because it starts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then there's a 3 piece somewhere, which is just in the middle. Of course, a list, you can imagine that is something completely laxist, or just, let's say, taking note of all the reality that is in the city. That is what's interesting for us, but of course it can be some kind of form of rhetoric which is much more planification or authoritarian way of thinking. This one, for example, is a very interesting work by Hans-Peter Feldman. I don't know if you know, it's a German artist, iconographer. This one is just pictures of all the things in the wardrobe of a woman. So it's a portrait of a woman by her clothes. What's interesting is that it is a computation of definition of something, not by its essence, but by some kind of cumulative way of thinking. That means that, for example, if a child asks his mother what is a tiger, so of course she can explain the scientific definition of a tiger, but she can also say to him, it's just like a cat, but bigger and ferocious, and can run very quickly, and so and describing by a sum of qualities. Maybe just to finish with the list, this very nice description of Robert Smithson on answering the question about the sensibility of the 60s is he answering with 10 different sensibilities of the 60s, and when you put them together, I cannot really read on my screen because it's too small, but I think you can read them, and it's really interesting the way it's describing, almost with contrary movements, the kind of spirit of the 60s. I go on. The second word is chaos. It's a mythological word concept, which is very interesting for us because it in a way captures the idea of contemporary city everywhere, in Europe, elsewhere. It's the idea of all the things together. What's also interesting in the myth of chaos is that it's an Occidental myth of the Greek mythology, but you can also find it in Taoism and Zen thinking from the East world. So it's both these definitions that I find extremely interesting, and that idea of everything that is really together. For example, this is Ovid's definition from Metamorphosis. Try to read, it's extremely small on my screen. Before the sea, the earth, the sky, and the sky that covers all the nature in the entire universe offered one single and homogeneous aspect. It was called chaos. It was informed and confused mass, inert block, stack of elements, well united and discordant. Everywhere around the earth, there were also the sea, the air. Thus the earth was unstable, the sea unsuitable for navigation, the air deprived of light, etc. So of course this question of chaos is kind of a long thing in the history of architecture and art and representation. I think what's interesting for us today in our way of working about the city is that the chaos that we work with every day is something which is completely non-spectacular. That means, for example, architects like Nicolas and Orson Venturi and others celebrated a very spectacular chaos and something which is completely ferocious and very spontaneous. The city that is produced just around us every day is much more gray chaos, quiet chaos of allotments, roads, infrastructures, psychiatric hospitals, etc., etc. So what we are trying to do is in a way find a way just to find some peaceful relation to chaos, neither to celebrate it nor to try to fix it. Yeah, this is the complicated and just fast. This is a wonton soup, maybe you know, a Chinese soup, related to the concept of chaos and all that. But I go back to Chinese chaos. I think it's very interesting because in Tao thinking, chaos is always very present, but it's some kind of a very sympathetic person or concept. It is something that is not at all feared. And there is this very beautiful story from Huang Tzu, I don't know if you know. It is the emperor of the the south was called Shu, the emperor of the north was called Hu, and the emperor of the center was called Hantan. Hantan is chaos in Chinese. Shu and Hu at times mutually came together and made Hutun's territory. Hutun treated them with great generosity. Shu and Hu then discussed how they could reciprocate Hantan's virtue, saying men all have 7 openings and that he didn't have any opening. And so each day they bored the hole through chaos. On the 7th day, chaos died. The idea about that is that in a way, they were talking about chaos, which was something which is completely informal, didn't have any form because it didn't have balls. And in order to make it human, in order to civilize him, they had to make him balls, like eyes, etc., to give him a face. And by doing that in 7 days, which are also the 7 days of creation, they killed him because they killed, in a way, its own energy and dynamics of creation. So, let's say between the Greek myth of chaos and the Taoist myth of chaos, what's interesting for us is that first, it was the first, that means that God did not create the world out of nothing, He created it out of chaos. That means He didn't create, He separated. He separated light from dark, He separated earth from sky, etc. And also that chaos is something which is completely informal, doesn't have form, and doesn't have, it's an opening without attributes. And maybe the most interesting is that it gives birth, creates and takes away, and therefore is the process. So this is what we like to work with the contemporary city. And this is why we also like this idea of neutrality. Not that we know how to be neutral always, but it's something that we look for and we try to when we work with the contemporary city. That means to try and search for ways of accepting everything, of absorbing everything, and representing all the simultaneous things that are happening in the city. So we're interested in Richter or Cedric Rice or all these other ways of representing chaos, not by celebrating some kind of very complex representation, but also with something which is very minimalistic and just tries to absorb all that is around it. Yeah, I'll just pass that, that's too much. And maybe just the last word in order to talk about the office is the idea of a method, not one single method, but many methods. We try to invent different methods for different territories and different subjects. The idea is that, for example, if we go back to Taoism, there is no distinction between the goal and the way to go there, unlike Western civilization. And so the idea is really that the method is as important as the final product. It's also when we work on urban scales and territorial scales, it's very important to share also with all the actors and politicians and technicians the idea of all the tools we work with and how we work with that. So it's very important to us. It's a question of representation, of showing things, of time, of all the things we do project with. That's it. So now I'll try maybe just to show 3 or 4 projects which are completely different scales and different questions. This one is the first one. I think I already showed that last year, so I'll do that extremely quickly just because it shows a very large scale work. This is what's for the master plan of Flanders, which is the northern region of Belgium. It's a work we did with Thomas Sieverts. I don't know if you know, kind of old German urban thinker, very interesting. I don't know if you know Flanders, but Flanders is a bit just a bit like Jackson Pollock. That means everything is the same wherever you go. There's no up, no down, no right, no left. You can find everything everywhere. There's just the urban footprint of Flanders, so you can just see the differences. There are quite huge differences between Flanders, which is in the center, the Netherlands, which is much more rationalized, that you see on the upper right corner, France, which is also rationalized on the lower left corner, and then Wallonia, which is like the big coal mining. And so it's territory which is dispersed all over, a little bit like the Veneto you have in Italy and around Milano. But also different, you have everything that is mixed together, industries, greenhouses, small houses, You have containers in the middle of the fields, etc. Just to show the difference. For example, this is the urban footprint of London, and this is Flanders at the same scale. So it's really something which is a completely different city. So they are now, the Flemish government doing the new master plan for Flanders. Let's say they try to do that. And they asked us to think about 2050 and how can we work within it. We thought, I won't show everything because it's very complicated, but maybe one or two very simple ideas. We had several, and these maybe the most important are the first one, radical decentralization, and the third one, which is planning without program. The idea is that all the post-war planning in Europe was based on program. The idea of growth, of we need to create new houses, new economy, new factories, new infrastructures, and all that. And so this growth was something that we need to plan and to draw and to do afterwards. The idea of planning without program is just that. If there's no more growth, we just need to plan without growth and to work only about recycling. So we worked on this zone, which is in West Flanders. It's 20 kilometers by 20 kilometers. It looks very green on the aerial map, but it's much more consumed with houses than that. And let's say people inside they live all in the same thing. It's like urban development, small houses, scattered all around. What we did is we looked upon the Ferraris Atlas, which is a representation of the 18th century, and we saw that, let's say, there were much more different landscapes inside than you can find now. So we separated actually the territory in two different layers, one which are the landscape figures and the other which are the urban settlements, which are all around. And we tried to see how these landscape forms can in a way create differences within this grey field. So the idea is if this is the houses all around, that the landscape form can be used as magnets and to create special qualities and also public spaces within these spaces and related to landscape, different landscape which are the forest, the waterways and the hill. And so just to take an example, for example, this was the forest in the 18th century. Of course, it's not all like this. Today, this is today. This is what is left of the forest. That means not much. Of course, the idea is not to go back to the 18th century, but to see what if, for example, we take all the fields, the agriculture, which is used today on unsuitable land, and we transform it back into forest. And that with that, we keep, let's say, 95% of what already exists, but we try to give this forest some kind of public programmation. That means with public sport facilities and all that, but also public houses which are higher above the canopy and have this kind of beautiful relation to landscape. So I'll just pass all that. We try to do the same work with the humid zones, the same with the small hill, knowing that the hill is only 15 meters, but in Flanders, 15 meters is already something in which you can see the horizon, which is not possible elsewhere. So the idea was that, let's say, the consumption of land is the same today and in 2050, and what the plan does actually, it just shifts small programs from one thing to another, from one shape, one form to the other, and try to find some kind of differences and coherence within that. Maybe that's enough. I'll go to architecture now. So this is, of course, completely different scale. It's a competition we just won 3 months ago for a very small art center in Flanders. It's an extension of an existing art center, which you see on the image, which is very, very peculiar. It was built by a French architect called Louis Janssen in 1970. Very interesting. It is called the Genoa School. I don't know if you know that. It's some kind of current in Belgium of the 70s that tried to do something a little bit like Scandinavian modernism with wood and zinc and some kind of bizarre forms and all that. Very interesting. And so we built that in the 70s, and you have this dome and then the small triangles. And today it's a residency for artists. They live in the small triangles. And then they work in the big dome, in the big the dome. And all that is just in the countryside. This is the site for the extension, which is just south of the dome. And the extension is for a new pavilion to put 400 square meters, half exhibition, and half silk screen atelier. The inside of the workspace is quite beautiful because you have all this kind of old machine for etching and silk screen and all this technique of art making. And it was built in a very peculiar way because it's, Louis Janssen in the 70s was very afraid of the idea of a factory and that putting all the machine together will very much look like a factory and not at all like an art center. And so in this way, each artist works and looks towards the exterior and doesn't see the other artists, and it's not like a very, not like a factory. So we'll go to the project. This is the project. Just to explain, let's say, the basic idea of the shape, of the strange shape, we just put another simple operation near the existing one. That means some kind of glass cylinder with a cone on the roof, and then we just do cuts inside of it. That means that all the walls, the red walls are brick walls, and then the facade is just glass facade, but not opening facade. You get inside and outside through the doors are in the brick facades on the outside. And so you have in the middle all coming together, and the exterior is the landscape. So it's a little bit like the first psychiatric hospital. But knowing that, you see, it's not really a star. That means we didn't want this kind of panoptical thing in which everyone sees everyone, but we wanted everyone to see the crossroad, but not to be seen by the other spaces. So things are a little bit moved around. So here is the kind of master plan, which is in relation to the existing building. This is the plan. Quite simple. On the left is more exhibition and entrance and all that, and on the right it's silk screen, atelier, dark room, etc., and the connection to the dome. Maybe just before showing more the architecture, just some what are the real ideas that we wanted to work with. The first was the idea of a factory. We were really fascinated by all these machines, which are really beautiful, and we thought that all this Louis Janssen idea about the factory was in a way not relevant anymore. That means that the idea of a factory today is something different. For example, Warhol factory was the idea that putting artists together and making them work together was some kind of very stimulated environment. And so the idea of a factory today as an art creation center is no longer has the same connotations in the past. And for us, the machines were really important, and they should be put together and shown and be some kind of the experience of the visiting of the center. And that's also what is interesting for us today in printing art is not so much the art itself, but also the way it crosses digital and analog processes together. So all these machines together with digital media is something which is very interesting to show. So in a way, the new buildings is try to create some kind of machine necklace going from the dome to the building on the south. Another idea was to create what we called some kind of free active space. That means that all the different spaces coming together are almost the same quality. And that in a way we can start with the exhibition on the left and something on the right, but it's more the way that you put the machines and the table inside and people inside that changes the way you use the space. So it can really evolve over time and you can move things around and all that. Another question for us which was extremely important was the question of relation between the visitor, the artist and the community, knowing that it's also a residency, some place where people, artists, they come, they stay for 6 months, so they actually sleep there for 6 months. And knowing that artists usually are kind of urbanite persons that put together in some kind of rural environment is a little bit complicated. We looked at, I don't know if you know McDowell Colony or Black Mountain College. These are very interesting relations. McDowell Colony is like 60 Pulitzer Prizes, I think, just for writers and also for artists. Black Mountain College was a very interesting institution. So it's about putting artists together, but on huge domains in which artists went outside and had time to be alone, let's say. The art center in which we work is much smaller. So what we were interested to do is that to find different relations through the new building between artists and visitors. That means that, for example, today there is a meeting place, which is on the top, that you can see here. It's a bit like a camping. You have all these kind of triangles all around, and artists are supposed to meet and to discuss, and I think it looks like a camping Pierre Vacances in France, which is not very famous for its special qualities. And so the idea is that you have this environment, you have the dome in which artists are more separated, but one next to another, and that we thought that the new building in a way should also create separations and create different spatial qualities in which you can separate yourself and then come together with others. There was also the idea of working more with the territory because it was in a beautiful context, landscape context, but very much closed. So the idea was to open it up. So the plan, what it tries to do is to take people from the dome and to open them up and to orient them towards the landscape. So also the building is in a way trying to captivate the different landscape qualities around. Fifth idea was the idea of the wall, knowing that graphical art is in a way, it's nothing, it's something you reproduce on a page and you put on a wall, so it's something that doesn't have any material consistency. And for graphical artists, it's very important that there is some kind of thick real wall to hang things on. And so what we try to do with the project is really to produce a lot of quantity of wall to work upon without creating separation between real exhibition and working space so that you can have, let's say, proofs, just working proofs next to real art creations, put one next to the other. Knowing that today also in the art center, because all of these kind of strange shapes, you have no vertical wall. You have either curved surfaces or glass surfaces, so it's completely impossible for an artist to just hang something on the wall and take 3 meters back and look at it. Yeah, and the last issue was the idea of 6 areas, 6 gardens. So you have all these kind of different areas within you occupy, but also different gardens that can be used as extension of the inside space. Maybe that's enough for this one. So the idea also was about the shape of it was, as I said before, not to create something in which you can see everything from everywhere, but in a way everyone is related to the crossroad or to the center, but you have all these kind of blind spots that you cannot be seen from other parts. And another thing what was important was about the relation between visitors and artists. It was important that there is a certain zone of ambiguity, but other zones in which maybe it's more about curiosity. That means, for example, when someone arrives, he sees that it's kind of atelier, the other side, so he can choose if he wants to go further or not, but there is no clear link between the two of them, just the idea of what you see the other side. Yeah, maybe one last word about the kind of materiality and all that. The idea is that you have the glass facade, which is not opening, which is more reflecting the landscape around it, and so you have all these kind of negative house-shaped brick facades that move around and has this shape, but which is the negative shape and the positive shape. Structure. Yeah, I can say maybe just a few words. So there's the idea of using, it's a very cheap building, I didn't say that, 500,000 euros. So it's nothing at all. In Switzerland you cannot even buy a newspaper with that. And so the idea was to do a really cheap thing with no crane, for example, and to use really short beams, like massive wood beams of maximum 6 meters. And so I don't know if you know the idea of reciprocal beam. It's a Renaissance idea of you had all these big palazzos, and you had, so instead of doing beams that run all around, you put one beam on the top of the other, and then you have smaller stands. And so if you push that further, it becomes this kind of souvenir spiral that works like that. Yes. Another project. So this is another competition, also in Belgium, and we also won this one, which is good news for us. So it's for a sport park in Genk. I don't know if you know Genk. It's it's a city. It's the only coal mine city in Flanders, which is a country for farmers, not for coal miners. What was the question? So you have in the middle of the city this kind of big forest with this very nice swimming pool, which is the big building you see, a very big parking in front of the swimming pool, and then some other sport activities, sport fields, which are the football fields that you see. The swimming pool is kind of nice. It's a very massive, very important concrete structures from the end of the 70s. Quite beautiful, actually. Here are some pictures from the time. It's kind of beautiful. And so, 5 years ago, the municipality wanted to add to this building some kind of big extension for a basketball field. And so the team that won the competition refused to do an extension, but just put another big box next to the first one. So you see, this is the swimming pool, and next to it is kind of a weird arc thing, is the new building that is under construction right now. Model. So this is the model with the two buildings, one next to the other. And so the architects, when they won the competition, they also drew some kind of square between the two of them. So this is why we had the competition, because once you have the two buildings, you have to do something in between. So the question was about putting something in between, some kind of urban space. This is the thing under construction. And so, what did we do with that? This is the master plan of the project. You can see the swimming pool on the left and the new building on the right. We didn't create one square, but we created 3 different spaces. Why 3 different spaces? I'm trying to explain that very quickly. These are 2 buildings. This is the client's wish to put a square between them and to program that with some basketball fields, I don't know what, skate park and all that. So we wanted the square to do a little bit more. First was we wanted it to connect, let's say, all the sport activities around the forest and not just the 2 buildings. We also wanted it to connect the forest and the river, which is on the side. So we wanted to produce not one single space, but 3 spaces that has 3 different special qualities and 3 different shapes. And then to take the program and to distribute it all around the 3 spaces and not to concentrate it in one single space. So in the end you have these 3 spaces, which are in a way some kind of strange shapes floating inside this forest or green open space. The first one, the kind of a 600 meters red stripe, is kind of forest strip, which is, the idea was to actually pass behind the swimming pool and to connect 2 parts of the city together with some kind of bike path and pedestrian path, and then to work in the forest and to chop down trees. Knowing that most of the trees are pine trees that were planted for the mines and that are not good for the ecosystem, and so we just take them, we chop them, we take them out, and we use the new clearings that are created to put new and future sport activities within the forest. And so this connection is more of a kind of territorial connection that connects all these different activities that can be just connected to this or in the forest, just as you saw before. So it's a very kind of light thing going through the forest, although it looks a bit brutal here, but the idea is really something floating 10 or 15 centimeters on the top of the ground, and then you have all these just kind of strange lamps passing between the trees. For the second space, which is in between the 2 buildings, it was much more complicated because this was the actual command, the client wish, and we couldn't just refuse it. We had the impression that you cannot just put urban space and ask it to perform in some kind of urban environment. It was completely impossible. The 2 buildings are interesting, maybe the old one more interesting than the new, but maybe we can consider both interesting, but both is like concrete structures, and what they give to the urban space is just like small doors, that's it. And so we thought you cannot just put beautiful public space and act as it was in Piazza. And we had the impression that there was very interesting relation between the two buildings, but it was very difficult for us to name these kind of relations. So we did this kind of strange iconographical work in which we tried to understand the relation just by using images, iconography that we found interesting about, for example, equivalence of two different shapes which are equivalent but very different one from the other. We had the impression that there was this kind of false alignment. They were half aligned but not really, and it depends where are you in space, and so there's one which is more in front than the other. There was the idea of one centrifugal and one centripetal that worked together in a very different way. But also that you have these two objects and that the relation was not direct between them, but it passed through the landscape that was behind them. I just pass. You're tired, I think. And so, let's say the conclusion of this work was that we actually didn't want to connect them with this kind of piazza, but rather to create an element which is a complete independent element between the two, which is in a way a third element. So, which is in a way an esplanade. I don't know if you know the word esplanade in French, but I guess also in English. The meaning of it is a kind of space which is in the edge of the city and which is in relation to landscape more than to architectural objects. So the idea was to create this kind of sand rectangle which is independent, doesn't touch the two buildings which are on the both sides, and just by its height it has this kind of territorial relation. And you have just 2 steps or 3 steps all around it, in which people, they just sit on the ground. Because it was also interesting that when you do sport activities, in a way you don't, you are not afraid of getting dirty, of getting close to the ground, and you look almost for this natural relation to public space, so we just wanted to work with that. And finally, the third space is on the bottom. It's supposed to change the relation between the car and the new building. So the cars move to the side, they are not in front of the building, just like in IKEA. And then you have this connection figure that connects to the river. Yeah, this is it. Should I do the last one? Do I have 10 minutes or not? Yes, you are tired, but that's okay. Okay, the last one, which is more an urban project we did together with Bauku in Geneva, Carrefour de l'Étoile. So the project, it was a kind of huge urban development of 400,000 square meters, supposed to be the first high-rise project in Geneva, which is more low-rise city regarding to other ones. And the site for this was the crossroad of the Étoile, which is somewhere here. Which is a very important crossroad in the entrance between France and Geneva. You can see it a little bit better here. So it's a development of 400,000 square meters on a really short, small parcel of 13 hectares. This is the model we did for the competition. Maybe just to explain it in a few words, what we wanted to do is maybe just 2 or 3 things. The first was, the first intuition was not to produce some kind of district, quartier, with some kind of proper atmosphere or identity, but was to really say that this was a crossroad, so something in which different parts of the city were coming together, and so didn't have to have an identity as a district, but more of the assemblance of all these districts. The other idea was to create some kind of piazza public space of 1.5 hectares. It's something we don't do quite often in urban projects today. We thought that if there was one single place that we can do a piazza in Geneva, and the plan today was over there. And maybe the last thing we wanted to do is that all the typologies are, this is not at all the same typology, but it's all the different systems that come together around the square. These are all drawings that explain the geographical position of the crossroad, the relation to Geneva, to the landscape. And so the idea is really that all these different typologies come together and that in a way the heterogeneous fabric all around is not at all a problem, but something that can really be of urban consistence. If, for example, we take Columbus Park in New York, I don't know if you know it, it's something which is quite similar in size, and they are just 150 meters, and you move from Chinatown to downtown, and it's completely different parts of the city just coming together. Also in this uber famous Miss on the Road project from Alexanderplatz, it's not at all the same typology, but some kind of different parts of the cities coming together around the Alexanderplatz. Much complicated. The idea was also the idea that it's concentrated systems around it, but so it's morphology of buildings, but also geographical, mechanical systems, landscape system, car system, water system, thread system. So it's all this kind of the new space, public space is creating, is helping to generate all this system coming together. And what was very important to us here was also to develop some kind of tools that could be really helpful to think of this urban process for the 60 or 70 coming years to think and to represent heterogeneous construction in a coherent way. That means that today this is not at all a municipal ground. These are banks, UBS and all that, so these are clients that you cannot just tell them, here we do this, here we do that. So the idea was to think of the project as something extremely flexible and reactive to all this kind of market thing, and to try to produce coherence out of fragments rather than first coherent and then cut it into fragments. Yes, I'll just show some phasing and then typologies. Too fast. I'll go back. Okay, go back, please. Okay, so these are all the typologies around the square: program, housing, offices, etc. These are the typologies and some references for each one of them. So there was this huge building that you see on the left, which is 120,000 square meters, which we proposed to build, of course we didn't win, on the top of the highway, and the reference was this beautiful Stevens Hotel in Chicago, maybe you know it. Very efficient building, which is on the top of a very generous public spaces. This was for the towers, which are on the other side, and for the thread system, which was on the south. This is the model. And really the idea that you have this kind of losange-like figure in the middle, and all these different environments coming